With a favorable schedule down the stretch, can Mizzou still secure a number one seed in March Madness? Plus a preview of Alabama 2 right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. Coming up on the show, got to talk about, of course, tomorrow's game against the Alabama Crimson Tide, a game that is not a must-win by any stretch of the imagination unless the Tigers want to get a number one seed in the tournament. And quite honestly, if the question is it still possible? Do the Tigers still have enough time to get a one seed in March Madness? Well, the short answer is yes. And quite obviously, Alabama's got to be a win for the Tigers tomorrow. But if you look around the rest of the country, like I was saying on yesterday's program, I do think that Auburn and Duke are probably a cut above the rest of the nation right now. That doesn't mean either team is unbeatable, obviously, but especially when it comes to this discussion, I don't think there's enough time for Missouri to catch Auburn at this point. But if you look at the other teams, especially that are competing for the rest of those number one seeds, well, you're looking at some teams that Missouri either beat or was really competitive with. Florida, Tennessee, and of course Alabama, who Missouri has a chance to knock off tomorrow. Also, the Houston Cougars have had a great season, of course, but you know, Houston has a tough schedule down the stretch, as does Alabama, Tennessee, Florida, at least much tougher relatively compared to Missouri. Once the Tigers get past Alabama, well, the toughest game remaining on the schedule, at least on paper, at home against Kentucky. Whereas, again, if you're looking at Houston, for example, the Cougars still have games against Iowa State, Kansas, Texas Tech. Those are three top 16 teams right now, and Ken Palm, Baylor as well, who's 29th. Compare that to Missouri, who has just, frankly, an easier schedule with a decent amount of home games and 3 road games against teams that Missouri has already picked wins up on the season in Arkansas, Vanderbilt, and South Carolina. So, obviously, though, if you're going to, and here's the other thing, Missouri's got to sweep the rest of these games. 6 games left. I think you sweep those games. That'll probably get you a double bye in the SEC tournament at 14-4. Then I think Missouri needs to win 2 more. If they simply then get, not simply, it won't be easy, but simply put, if Missouri gets to the finals of the SEC tournament, I think that would do it. I think if Missouri goes on a little 8-game winning streak, well, it'd actually be 10 if you include Georgia and Oklahoma, of course, but 8 to end the season here. The last 6 of the regular season, throw in, I think, 2 just to make the finals, the SEC championship. Famously lately, that Sunday game doesn't even necessarily factor in to the NCAA tournament committee's decision-making when it comes to seeding. But I really think, especially the kind of quality, especially that semifinal game would almost certainly give you another huge resume builder if you're Missouri. I think a number one seed is at least still on the table. Don't think it's likely by any means, but on the table, I think that path that I just laid out for you, certainly not impossible. You don't have to squint that hard to figure it out. And when it comes to the Crimson Tide, well, this Nate Oats team is similar in a lot of ways to all of his teams at Alabama. They still shoot a ton of three-pointers at an extremely fast pace, but the Tide aren't really making their three-pointers at a really high rate this year. I'll also say this is maybe Alabama's best rebounding team that I've seen, at least from my eyes. Dennis Gates has said specifically in his press conference in the last day that the Tide are a really good offensive rebounding team. And he's right. And it's not just because they start 3 guys who are listed at 6'11", It's also because they get rebounds offensively in non-traditional ways as well, because they play at such a fast pace, because they get three-pointers up so quickly. Well, what does that lead to? Not only a lot of long rebounds, but defenses scrambling and trying to get back into position as well. And the Tide, to their credit, I think Oats really coaches this. They always make sure that their shooters are, while trying to get back on defense, at the very least, be aware of that, of the caroms, those long rebounds. At least be aware. Don't just be asleep out there and watch your shot. At least be aware of the possibility of following it while not being overly aggressive and getting out of balance for getting back in the fast break game. So the thing is, with Alabama, they are prone to turnovers offensively as well. So not only are they not the greatest shooting team right now, they are prone to turnovers. And like Missouri, well, they want to get shots off early in the clock. Defensively, Alabama really about right on par with Missouri statistically. And while they do turn the ball over offensively, defensively, that's not really their forte at all. They're one of the worst in the country at turning their opposition over. So hopefully this is a fairly comfortable game for Missouri in the half court, just in terms of offensive execution. That would be definitely something that's nice to see. From a defensive strategy perspective, if you're Missouri, I'm going to be interested to see how much Dennis Gates and his squad decide to switch defensively, to switch ball screens in particular, but off-ball screens as well. Because when I was watching the game against Auburn, as I'm sure many of you did, the first number 1 versus number 2 matchup of two SEC teams in history, well, one thing Auburn did, I thought they did a nice job of getting Alabama's offense a little bit stagnant by just forcing them into a lot of one-on-one drives. Now, Alabama loves to drive the ball and kick it, but of course, when they do so, they want to get you helping, they want to get you off kilter, and basically what I'm trying to say is when the ball is moving quickly, when the ball is moving side to side and around the perimeter for Alabama, boy, they're an awful tough team to keep up with when they're playing their game. But if you make them get into a one-on-one type of game, well, I think they're a lot more ordinary, to be honest with you, because some of their best players are not, I wouldn't say are just among the elite offensive players in the country, that type of deal. Grant Nelson, for example, one of those 6'11" starters for the Crimson Tide. Well, to me, he's a classic guy who would have, under the old system, the pre-NIL system and portal and all that stuff, he's the classic guy who would have already been in the NBA, or at least tried his hand in pro basketball. More likely, he would be a European pro basketball player at this point because, well, while he may not have the skills to be an NBA player, under the old system, the idea was, well, get out of town and get your money as soon as you can. But I'll say this, a 6'9", 6'10", 6'11", as he's listed there. I'm not sure if he's actually 6'11", to be honest with you. But a guy with decent skills. He's really more of a driver, though, I would say, than a shooter. He's sub 30% from downtown for his career. Obviously, that's going to have to get better at the next level. But if I'm Mark Mitchell or whoever Missouri matches up on Nelson, I think Mitchell can be a potentially really good matchup against Nelson, by the way, with his ability to move too. Tell Mitchell, the left-handed player, to use that strong hand of his and be right on Nelson's right hand, because that's definitely the way that he likes to drive 90% of the time. And you know what? Speaking of some of those other Alabama players, oh man, after my Zakai Ziegler take, I'm a little bit shy, but not that shy, folks, because Mark Sears, like Ziegler, a heck of a player, but I think he's a little bit overrated. Yes, I'm about to do it again, but I'll do it here in just a little bit, because first I got to tell you about TurboTax. This message is, of course, from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. You see, taxes was dealing with piles of paperwork and frustrating forms, and then waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back. Well, now taxes is easily uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who's matched to your unique tax situation, an expert who's backed by the latest technology with cross-checks, millions of data points for 100% accuracy. And while they work on your taxes, you'll get real-time updates on their progress, and you get the most money back guaranteed. And while you go about your day, by the way, so no stressing, no worrying, no waiting. Now this is taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now at TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax. Live full service, real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at turbotax.com/guarantees. So not that any of the Tennessee fans who are trolling me the last couple weeks are going to listen to this or care, but believe it or not, I actually like Zakai Ziegler and I like his game. I just simply don't think he's one of the top 7 or 8 players in the entire country, as Jimmy Dike said. Just because I think he's maybe 15th or 20th, that doesn't mean I think he sucks, okay? Well, I feel similarly about Mark Sears at Alabama, who, while he's having a really good season, the lead point guard there for the Crimson Tide, it's not as good as last season, especially with the shot where Sears shot well over 40% from downtown. But really, that's looking like the outlier now in his career, where Sears is settling into more something like a 34-35% shooter. That just seems like what he's like. And frankly, inside the arc, he's pretty average too, except when he gets to the free throw line, which he does quite frequently and makes well over 80% of his free throws. So if you're Missouri, are you able to... By the way, he'll commit some fouls himself too. So if you're Missouri, can you use that home whistle to your advantage on both ends of the court against Mark Sears? Of course, well, that home whistle usually goes in the home team's favor, especially when there's a big crowd in play. But, well, it's not a 100% guarantee. That's for darn sure. And bottom line here is, again, while Sears, I think, is absolutely an all-SEC caliber type of player, again, I just think nationally, I think sort of like Ziegler, again, maybe this is my opinion. I'm sure all Alabama fans will throw this back in my face if they win on Wednesday. But you know what? Scared money doesn't make money, folks. I'm sticking by my guns here. I think the 6'1", 190-pound Sears, last season, you look at him nationally, his offensive rating, again, with that three-point shot last year, 33rd in the country out of some 2,000-plus Division I basketball players. Well, this season is about 450th. Again, 33rd versus 450th. 450th is still good. It's still solidly above average. I just think that's more in line with who he's been. His junior year, by the way, his first year at Alabama, and also, well, his 2 seasons at the University of Ohio as well. I don't think this is not exactly a controversial statement I'm making here, but if Mark Sears scores 25 in a victory, I know Alabama fans are going to make it out to be that way. That's okay. Just part of the game. I already mentioned Grant Nelson, one of those 6'11" starters for Alabama. Also, Clifford Omoruyi, the transfer from Rutgers, playing his senior season with the Tide. One of the best offensive ratings in the country because, quite simply, he rarely shoots the ball outside of the paint. And a 63% free throw shooter, not anything to brag about, but again, nearly 75% from the field is Cliff Omoruyi, sort of a Ricardo Ratliff-like number there. He's your kind of your lob guy, that type of deal. Not a shooter, again, not a jump shooter whatsoever, but a young man who obviously knows what he does well and sticks to it. Just look for him to set a lot of ball screens for the Crimson Tide because, again, they like to play 5 out. So what do you do with a guy who can't shoot jump shots if he's 6'11"? Generally going to have him set a lot of ball screens. So when Omoruyi is the screen guy, again, it will be interesting to see how Missouri plays that. Are they going to trap Mark Sears there, as they have done at times, especially against smaller ball handlers, especially to really good effect against Mississippi State? I thought that particular strategy served Missouri really well. I could see that happening here, not as quite as much because, well, Alabama, generally they move the ball so well, but the shooting of Alabama, again, makes me want to say early in the ball game, if I'm Dennis Gates, if it's a Mark Sears, Cliff Omoruyi ball screen, I want to see a trap here. And let's just see how Nate Oats and Mark Sears play that. And your third starter listed at 6'11" for the Crimson Tide is Jaron Stevenson. And indeed, this just feels like a longer Alabama squad than normal. You look on the average height statistic here, and, well, it seems about on par with Nate Oats, his time in Tuscaloosa, and yet this does feel like a longer and more athletic Alabama starting unit in particular. So they do make up for the fact that they're not quite as good of a shooting squad as they normally are with Oats. With that, I think improved athleticism and maybe one of the better defensive teams that Oats has ever had. Also, defensively, speaking of the three-point line, I would say look for Nate Oats to sag way off of Mark Mitchell anytime he is outside of the three-point line, just absolutely daring him to shoot the ball. That's sort of a Nate Oats specialty. He's just going to play the percentages as much as he possibly can, and I think psychologically, I think that's something that he likes to that's a tactic he likes to employ as well. And again, sticking with this theme of jump shooting, well, Aiden Holloway, he's been by far Alabama's best three-point shooter so far, number 2 in his second season in college basketball, though his first with Alabama after he transferred, notably from, yes, wait for it, the Auburn Tigers. Holy cow, talk about the balls on Aiden Holloway. My goodness, I hope the NIL payment was worth it. And if Missouri is going to reach all of its goals, say, hey, maybe win the SEC tournament, maybe get a number 1 seed in March Madness, and dare I say it, maybe make its first Final Four in program history. Well, if any of that is going to happen, I'd say a little bit more consistency from a couple Missouri sophomores would go a heck of a long way. So let's talk about that after these quick words. So as I've said, I think Auburn and Duke are in my personal top tier in college basketball right now. You can argue with that and quibble with that, certainly. I'm not even 100% married to that take whatsoever. But regardless, I think when Anthony Robinson, our sophomore point guard, when he is as good as he played against Georgia, when he's just on his A game, I really think Missouri can beat absolutely anyone, including the Blue Devils and the Auburn Tigers. So the thing is, Anthony Robinson has shown at times, and by the way, another sophomore, Missouri's Trent Pierce, whose shot has left him a little bit here the last few games, if those guys can just be a little bit more consistent, because at times both guys have shown that they're all SEC potentially type of players. I think especially Robinson, when he's at his best, I think he's an all SEC type of player, and I think may very well still be at some point in his future. Trent Pierce, the same deal. Occasionally with his long body, his beautiful jump shot, all of the things that the multi-talents that he has, the fact that even though he's a fairly slight guy, he still helps out defensively and on the defensive glass as well. I think a lot of people think Trent Pierce is a possible pro someday. But again, both of those guys are going to get there. If they're going to reach their ceiling, if this Missouri team is going to reach its ceiling, well, it's all about consistency. Now, I don't want to be too hard on Trent Pierce here in particular, because what he's asked to do by Missouri is, for the most part, stand outside and launch up a lot of three-pointers, a lot of long jump shots. And while there's nothing wrong with three-pointers, I'm not anti-jump shot or anything. There is something to be said for, hey, when it's not going in, you miss your first 3 or 4 in a row, it makes it hard to get into a rhythm. And also, you've got to be a really strong-willed person and a really confident person to trust that 5th attempt after the first 4 have not gone in. That's just simply human nature. So, and also, another thing with Pierce, too, as somebody who follows the NBA, I think when you have an 82-game season, I think your mind has a little bit different expectations when, like, a 5-game streak of maybe not the best shooting in the world, when that's, 5% of your season, just about a little bit more than that, doesn't feel like the end of the world. But whereas 5 games in a college basketball season, well, obviously that's more than 10% of the season. So I think some of that is just, hey, sometimes you just go into slumps. Sometimes your shot comes and goes. And you see this, again, my point in saying, hey, the NBA, there are times when Steph Curry will go a couple 3 games without having his perfect touch. It happens, even to some of the greatest shooters who have ever lived. But my point here is that Trent Pierce, Anthony Robinson, a couple of really talented Missouri sophomores, a couple of guys who have been a big part of this team and have really helped us win. My point here is that a lot of just greatness in general, this isn't even necessarily about them specifically, but it did get me thinking that a lot of what makes the greatest players great truly is consistency. No matter where you come down on the MJ versus LeBron argument, for example, well, even in Michael Jordan's era, Kobe Bryant, whoever you want to take, there are guys that were just as athletic as Michael Jordan, as freakishly athletic as he was. Well, there were guys who were as athletic as he was, and yet they weren't as consistent as he was. See, Michael Jordan, especially injury-wise, health-wise too, his second season, he missed maybe 60 games or so with a broken foot. Other than that, he was frickin' out there. 82 games a year, basically without fail. Similarly, some people will say, well, LeBron doesn't play a full 82 anymore. Fair enough. Frankly, nobody does in this era. But the point is, regardless, LeBron James for 20 years, basically, 21, 22 years now, is out there every single night. And I think maybe he finally scored fewer than 10 points for the first time in like 19 years or something like that. So again, my point here is even LeBron and even Jordan, as talented as they were, well, there were plenty of guys out there, a handful, at least I don't mean plenty as in thousands, but plenty as in more than 10 guys who were just as athletic as they were, but they weren't as consistent. So I don't know. I just thought that was an interesting thought. Hopefully you thought it was an interesting thought as well, or else what the heck are you doing listening to my podcast? But seriously, thanks for listening to Locked On Mizzou as always, and for making it your first listen today. And for your second listen, check out Locked On College Basketball with Isaac Shade and Andy Patton. Don't wait for March. Be the most informed college hoops fan now. Find Locked On College Basketball on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And until next time, and you know what? I'm going to skip an afternoon show on Wednesday. Just the timing of everything, snow days, all that good stuff. I'm a little bit off kilter with my usual schedule here. So we'll just do a post game with my next episode of Locked On Mizzou. I'll see you either late tomorrow night or quite possibly, since it is an 8 p.m. tip-off, probably quite honestly tomorrow, the next day, Thursday morning, for the next edition of Locked On Mizzou.